They thought they could bully an old man out of his own land with a single piece of paper. A $250,000 fine slapped on a 71-year-old retiree for violating the sacred rules of a millionaire's club called Sunset Hills. But Walter Harrison, a surveyor with 45 years of dirt under his nails, wasn't about to let a bunch of mansion owners steal what his father fought to keep. What he uncovered in his backyard would turn their perfect world upside down and make them wish they'd never sent that letter. Walter Harrison had lived on his 8-acre plot in Sunset Hills, a quiet corner of New England, for 30 years. His modest home, surrounded by a vegetable garden, a chicken coop, and a gazebo his late wife Jane loved, was a slice of the American dream his father had carved out in 1973. The neighborhood had changed over the decades. Farmland gave way to sprawling mansions owned by wealthy newcomers, but Walter's life stayed the same. Until that Tuesday morning when a certified letter from the Sunset Hills Homeowners Association landed in his mailbox like a ticking bomb. The envelope was heavy, sealed with gold-embossed lettering that screamed money and trouble. Walter stood in his gravel driveway, the morning sun warming his weathered hands as his neighbor Betty Harris waved from across the street. "Morning mail bringing good news, Walter?" she called out, oblivious to the storm brewing inside that envelope. Walter tore it open and his heart sank. The HOA was fining him a $250,000 fine for 3 violations: an illegal fence beyond his property line, unauthorized structures in a community setback area, and encroachment on designated green space. His fence, his shed, his chicken coop, his garden, all built by his father decades ago, were suddenly illegal. Walter's blood boiled. He'd been a surveyor for 45 years, reading property lines like most people read newspapers. His fence had stood in the same spot since before these mansion owners were born. His garden had grown tomatoes since their fancy lawns were just dirt patches. And that gazebo? It was where Jane used to watch the sunset every evening. The HOA's claims were nonsense, and Walter smelled a rat. Within hours, Sophia Blackstone, the HOA's president, marched across his yard like a general inspecting a battlefield. Her designer heels clicked on the gravel, followed by 2 board members clutching clipboards like weapons. Sophia, with her polished smile and $5,000 suit, looked at Walter's property as if it were a stain on her perfect neighborhood. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I'm here to document these violations before we proceed with legal action." She pointed at his fence, his shed, his chicken coop, his garden, declaring each a crime against community standards. Walter pulled out his 1973 property deed, showing the boundaries his father had marked. Sophia dismissed it with a wave of her manicured hand. She said, "Those old papers are irrelevant. Modern surveys show you're trespassing on HOA land." Betty, watching from her porch, chimed in, "That fence has been there for 25 years. But Sophia's cold smile didn't waver. "You're both confused about the updated boundaries," she said, threatening legal action and a forced sale if Walter didn't comply within 30 days. Most folks would have buckled under the pressure of a $250,000 fine and a lawyer's threats. But Walter wasn't most folks. He'd spent decades measuring land, spotting scams, and standing up to bullies. Something about Sophia's confidence and the mention of a 2010 survey set off alarm bells. Why a new survey 5 years after the mansions were built? He called his old friend Jim Patterson, a property lawyer with 30 years of experience. Jim took one look at the HOA's papers and said, "Walter, this stinks worse than a backed-up sewer. Get an independent survey done, now." That evening, Walter dusted off his old surveyed gear, GPS units, metal detectors, measuring tools. If the HOA wanted to play games with his land, they'd picked the wrong fight. Using his handheld GPS, he checked his fence line and found it matched his deed to the inch. But then he noticed something odd. Buried under the manicured landscaping of Sophia's mansion,
he found original survey stakes, iron pins marking boundaries far beyond his fence. His property wasn't just where he thought. It was bigger, much bigger. Walter stood in his yard, staring at Sophia's infinity pool, Nathan Cross's 4-car garage, Alana Foster's sprawling bedroom wing. The stakes suggested these million-dollar structures were sitting on his land. His heart raced, not with fear, but with the thrill of a fight he was born to win. The HOA thought they could intimidate an old man. They were about to learn what happens when you mess with a surveyor who knows his rights.
They thought they could bury the truth under their million-dollar lawns, but Walter Harrison was digging deeper, literally. Armed with a GPS unit and 45 years of surveying grit, the 71-year-old retiree was about to expose a scam that would shake Sunset Hills to its core. What he and his old friend Jake Miller uncovered wasn't just a property line dispute. It was a deliberate theft orchestrated years ago. And the deeper they dug, the dirtier the HOA's secrets became. Walter Harrison stood in his backyard at dawn, the air crisp with the promise of a fight. The discovery of those buried survey stakes had lit a fire in him, one that no $250,000 fine could extinguish. His 8-acre plot in Sunset Hills wasn't just his home, it was his legacy. A piece of land his father had bought with sweat and dreams in 1973. Now, the HOA, led by the imperious Sophia Blackstone, was trying to steal it with a fancy letter and a fake survey. But Walter wasn't alone. He called in Jake Miller, the best surveyor in 3 counties, to prove what his gut already knew. The land was his, and those mansions were trespassing. Jake arrived that morning with a truck full of gear, GPS base stations, laser measurers, ground-penetrating radar. "Walter," he said, setting up a tripod with the precision of a surgeon, "if these people are playing games with your property, we're about to checkmate them with technology that doesn't lie." Walter nodded, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. For 3 weeks, they'd map every inch of his 8 acres, using his 1973 deed as their guide. If the HOA wanted a war, they'd get one fought with satellites and steel. The first week was a revelation. Jake's GPS readings confirmed Walter's fence was exactly where it should be, down to the inch. But the real shock came when they followed the buried stakes. Using a metal detector, Walter unearthed iron pins hidden under decades of landscaping, pins that marked his property line 50 to 75 feet beyond his fence in multiple directions. Sophia's infinity pool, Nathan Cross's 4-car garage, Alana Foster's sprawling bedroom wing, Jackson Murphy's outdoor kitchen, Bethany Wells' manicured lawn, all were built on land that legally belonged to Walter. The scope of the encroachment was staggering. Over $2 million in structures sat on his property. Sophia wasn't about to let this slide. By day 3, she was back, this time with a new violation notice accusing Walter of unauthorized agricultural activity because of his chickens. She stood in his driveway, her clipboard gleaming like a badge of authority. "Mr. Harrison, your livestock is a health hazard," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "The HOA will escalate this to code enforcement if you don't comply." Walter just smiled, his surveyor's instinct kicking in. "Escalate all you want, Mrs. Blackstone. I'm measuring my land, and you're standing on it right now." Betty Harris, ever the loyal neighbor, kept watch from her porch, noting the growing panic in Sophia's daily visits. "She's been on the phone nonstop," she said, whispered to Walter over coffee. "Says you're causing a disturbance with all this equipment." Walter chuckled, but his eyes were hard. The HOA was circling like vultures, and Sophia was doubling down. Noise complaints about his rooster, health department calls about his compost pile, even a letter claiming his shed violated fire codes. Every day brought a new harassment, each one designed to wear him down. But Walter and Jake were relentless. By week 2, Jake's ground-penetrating radar revealed more than just stakes. It showed deliberate tampering. The original survey pins had been moved during the mansion construction 15 years ago, buried under layers of dirt inside to hide the truth. "This isn't an accident," Jake said, his voice low as he studied the data. "Those mansions weren't built by mistake." The revelation hit like a punch. This wasn't just about a fence or a fine. It was a calculated land grab, and Walter was the last man standing in their way.
The smoking gun came when Jake tracked down the 2010 survey cited in the HOA's violation notice. It was supposedly filed by a company that went bankrupt in 2008, 2 years before the survey's date. The signatures didn't match any licensed surveyor in the state, and the coordinates were mathematically impossible. "This document is a fake," Jake said, shaking his head. "Someone forged it to shrink your property and justify those mansions." Walter's hands trembled, not with fear, but with rage. For 15 years, someone had been stealing his land, and the HOA was complicit. Sophia's desperation was palpable. She tried to discredit Jake, questioning his credentials and demanding to see his state license. Jake handed her his business card, complete with a surveyor's seal and 20 years of experience. Her face went pale, but she didn't back down. "Lady, you the one who's been trespassing, and I'm just getting started." By the end of week 3, Jake's 40-page survey report was complete, a masterpiece of GPS coordinates, legal descriptions, and photographic evidence. It showed Walter's property extending far beyond his fence, cutting through the heart of 5 mansions. Sophia's pool, Nathan's garage, Elena's bedroom, Jackson's kitchen, Bethany's lawn, all were on Walter's land, confirmed by satellite precision and his father's deed. The report was a legal grenade, and Walter was ready to pull the pin. The HOA announced an emergency meeting to address Walter's continued violations. Sophia clearly planned to rally the community against him, painting him as a troublemaker threatening property values. But Walter saw his chance. He and Jake prepared a presentation that would lay bare the truth: maps, photos, GPS data, and the fake 2010 survey. As he loaded his equipment into his truck, Walter felt the weight of the fight ahead. The HOA thought they could silence him with threats and fines. They were about to face a surveyor with nothing to lose and the truth on his side.
They thought they could silence him with sneers and legal threats, but Walter Harrison walked into that HOA meeting with a weapon no one expected: cold, hard truth. A 71-year-old surveyor with a GPS unit and a 40-page report was about to turn Sunset Hills upside down. What happened in that community center would leave jaws on the floor and 5 millionaires scrambling to save their mansions. But when the dust settled, Sophia Blackstone's next move would spark a legal war that could cost Walter everything. The Sunset Hills Community Center buzzed like a courtroom before a high-stakes trial. Cars packed the parking lot, more than Walter had seen in 15 years of HOA meetings. Word of his property dispute had spread like wildfire, and half the neighborhood showed up expecting to watch the old surveyor get humiliated. Sophia Blackstone had transformed the room into her stage, complete with a head table for the 5 board members, a microphone system, and a projector screen ready to display Walter's violations. She sat in her $1,000 business suit, flanked by 2 attorneys who looked like they charged by the syllable, her face a mask of smug confidence. Walter sat in the back row, his old survey briefcase at his side, Jake Miller's GPS unit in his hand. He wasn't nervous, just ready. For 3 weeks, he and Jake had mapped his 8 acres with satellite precision, uncovering a scam that went back 15 years. The HOA's $250,000 fine was based on a fake 2010 survey, and their mansions, Sophia's pool, Nathan's garage, Elena's bedroom, Jackson's kitchen, Bethany's lawn, were built on Walter's land. Tonight, he'd show the world. Sophia opened the meeting with a performance that could have won an Oscar for manipulation. Enlarged photos of Walter's fence, shed, and chicken coop flashed on the screen, each labeled a violation of community standards. Her voice dripped with pity as she painted Walter as a confused old man disrupting the neighborhood's harmony. Nathan Cross complained about the rooster waking him up. Elena Foster fretted about wildlife from Walter's garden. Jackson Murphy called the shed an eyesore, and Bethany Wells muttered about safety concerns. Their attorney wrapped up with a lecture on the serious consequences of challenging the HOA, making Walter sound like a criminal. When Sophia called his name, the room went silent. Walter walked to the front, slow and deliberate, setting up Jake's laptop and connecting it to the projector. "Folks," he said, his voice steady as the land he'd measured for 45 years. "I've been a surveyor since most of you were in diapers. Tonight you'll see the difference between accusations and facts." The first slide hit the screen like a thunderbolt. A drone photo of Sunset Hills with red lines showing GPS-verified property boundaries slicing through the mansions. The audience gasped, a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. Walter clicked through his presentation, each slide a nail in the HOA's coffin. Sophia's $300,000 infinity pool? On his land. Nathan's 4-car garage? His property. Elena's bedroom wing? Jackson's kitchen? Bethany's fountain? All built on ground Walter inherited from his father. GPS coordinates, legal descriptions, and photos of buried survey stakes backed every claim. Then came the bombshell, the 2010 survey. "This document," Walter said, projecting the forged signatures and fake coordinates, "is a lie. The company was defunct. The surveyors don't exist. Someone stole my land to build these mansions." The room erupted. Neighbors whispered, some nodding, others glaring at the board. Betty Harris stood up, her voice shaking but firm. "I saw them move Walter's boundary markers 15 years ago during construction. They told us it was for the new development. I thought it was legal." Other longtime residents chimed in, their memories aligning with the truth on the screen. The mood shifted from skepticism to shock, then anger, as the community realized they'd been duped by a decade-long scam. Sophia's composure cracked. She accused Walter of fabricating evidence, called Jake's credentials questionable, and claimed the GPS data was unreliable. Walter didn't flinch. He pulled out his handheld GPS unit, showing live coordinates that matched the buried stakes to the inch. "Mathematics doesn't lie," he said, staring straight at Sophia. "Unlike your survey." Her attorney tried to argue that old deeds were irrelevant, but Walter's lawyer, Jim Patterson, shut him down. He said recorded deeds are legal gospel. No HOA bylaw can change that. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Board members made frantic calls to their lawyers. Neighbors argued over property values, and Sophia shouted for order, her voice drowned out by the crowd. Walter packed his equipment calmly, the storm raging around him. He'd done what he came to do, expose the truth. But as he left, Sophia's icy glare promised this wasn't over. By morning, his phone was ringing. Jim Patterson's voice was grim. "Walter, Sophia's hired the state's top property litigation firm. They're suing you for fraud, harassment, and emotional distress. This is war." Walter sat on his porch, staring at the survey stakes glinting in the dawn light. The HOA had underestimated him, but this new legal battle could drain his savings and his spirit. He thought of his late wife Jane, who had always said some fights were worth the cost. With a 40-page report in his hands and the truth on his side, Walter knew one thing. He wasn't backing down. The courtroom was calling, and he was ready to answer.
They thought they could crush him with expensive lawyers and endless paperwork, but Walter Harrison had truth on his side, and a 40-page survey report that no courtroom could ignore. The 71-year-old retiree was now locked in a legal war with Sunset Hills elite, where every deposition felt like a battle for his legacy. What unfolded in those 8 months of courtroom drama would test Walter's resolve like never before. But when Sophia Blackstone's desperate tactics backfired, the underdog surveyor would prove that justice isn't bought, it's measured. The morning after the explosive HOA meeting, Walter's phone rang before his rooster could crow. It was Jim Patterson, his lawyer friend, his voice urgent. "Walter, Sophia's not wasting time. She's hired the state's top property litigation firm, the kind that eats disputes like this for breakfast. They're filing a countersuit, fraud, harassment, emotional distress. This is going to be ugly." Walter sat on his porch, staring at the survey stakes glinting in the dawn light. The HOA had underestimated him in the meeting, but this was different. This was a legal siege, and it could drain his savings dry. But backing down wasn't an option. "File whatever we need, Jim," Walter said. "My father's land isn't for sale." Jim brought in Jane Mitchell, a sharp-tongued property attorney with 20 years of battling developers.
She reviewed Jake's survey report and whistled. "Walter, this is gold. Your 1973 deed is ironclad, and GPS tech is the new standard. But these folks have deep pockets. They'll drag this out to break you." Jane filed a formal boundary dispute in County Superior Court, seeking a declaratory judgment on ownership based on the deed and GPS data. Within 48 hours, Sophia's team fired back with a countersuit, claiming Walter was a vindictive old man fabricating claims to extort money. The filing fees alone hit Walter like a punch, but he dipped into his savings, money he'd saved for his grandchildren. The discovery phase was grueling, like dental work without anesthesia. Both sides demanded documents, 50 years of property records, surveyor qualifications, expert testimonies. Walter spent hours in depositions, answering questions about his memory, motives, and mental competency. Sophia's lawyers tried to paint him as senile, but Walter stayed calm. "I've measured land for 45 years. GPS doesn't forget, and neither do I." Meanwhile, Sophia ramped up the harassment, noise complaints about his tools, health inspections of his coop, even a code violation for his gazebo. Every week brought a new letter designed to wear him down. Media attention exploded. Local news loved the David versus Goliath angle, an elderly surveyor taking on millionaires. Property rights groups offered support, and Walter's story went viral on social media. Elderly homeowners shared similar HOA horror stories, and real estate lawyers called to discuss cases. Walter never sought the spotlight, but it helped. Advocacy groups filed friend-of-court briefs, arguing GPS surveying set a new legal standard. Settlement negotiations came in month 2, feeling like hostage talks. Sophia's team offered $50,000 to resolve the misunderstanding, then $100,000, then $200,000. "This is generous for a simple dispute," Sophia's attorney said, with veiled threats about litigation costs. Walter turned them all down. "This isn't about money, it's about my land." His legal bills climbed past $75,000, forcing him to sell some tools. But Jane kept him going. "We're winning on facts," she said. "Their experts can't debunk GPS." Expert battles heated up in month 4. Sophia hired a rival surveyor who claimed GPS was unreliable, arguing traditional methods should prevail. Jake countered with tech experts, demonstrating satellite accuracy within inches. "This isn't opinion, it's math," Jake testified. The judge seemed impressed, and Walter's side gained ground. By month 6, pre-trial motions flew like arrows. Arguments over evidence admissibility, expert qualifications, GPS validity. The local Surveyors Association backed Walter, and advocacy groups argued allowing rich defendants to ignore deeds would undermine property rights. Sophia's desperation showed. She offered Walter $2 million for his 8 acres. "Take it and avoid trial uncertainty," her attorney urged. Walter looked at Sophia across the table. "My property lines don't change because you built on them." Trial prep in month 8 felt like gearing for war. Witness lists, exhibits, jury selection for what had become the state's most watched property case. Jake prepared GPS demos. Jane assembled presentations tracing 50 years of ownership. As Walter reviewed maps in his kitchen, he thought of Jane, his wife. "Some battles define you," she'd say. The courthouse awaited, packed with media and supporters. Walter was ready, but Sophia's final trick loomed, a motion to suppress Jake's report, claiming bias. If it passed, Walter's case could crumble.
They thought they could outlast him, bury him in legal fees, and silence him with power. But Walter Harrison stood in that courtroom with the weight of truth in his hands. The 71-year-old surveyor had fought for 9 months against Sunset Hills elite, and now, in the final trial, every eye was on him. What unfolded under those courthouse lights would rewrite the neighborhood's history and prove that one man's fight for his land could topple a millionaire's empire. For Walter, this wasn't just a victory. It was a promise kept to his late wife, Jane. The County Superior courtroom was a circus. Reporters packed the gallery, their cameras clicking like vultures circling a battlefield. Property rights activists waved signs outside, chanting Walter's name, while social media buzzed with #JusticeForWalter. Inside, Sophia Blackstone sat with her high-powered legal team, her face a mask of forced calm. Her attorneys had tried to suppress Walter's GPS report, claiming Jake Miller's survey was biased, but the judge rejected their motion. "The court will hear the evidence," he ruled, his voice cutting through the tension like a gavel. Walter, at the plaintiff's table with Jane Mitchell and Jim Patterson, gripped his 1973 deed, his lifeline through this war. The trial began with a parade of experts. Jake took the stand, his 40-page survey report projected on a screen. GPS coordinates, drone photos, buried stakes, all proving Walter's property extended 50 to 75 feet beyond his fence, slicing through Sophia's pool, Nathan's garage, Alina's bedroom, Jackson's kitchen, and Bethany's lawn. "These boundaries are verified to within an inch," Jake testified, showing live GPS data. Sophia's hired surveyor fumbled, unable to challenge satellite precision with outdated methods. The courtroom murmured as the judge nodded, scribbling notes. Then came the bombshell. Jane Mitchell called a surprise witness, Tom Carver, a retired clerk from the county records office. Tom revealed a 2008 memo he'd found, buried in archives, linking Sophia's late husband, a real estate developer, to the defunct company behind the fake 2010 survey. "They redrew boundaries to expand the development," Tom testified, producing emails showing payments to a surveyor who vanished after the job. The courtroom gasped. Sophia's face drained of color, her hands trembling as she whispered to her attorneys. The scam wasn't just negligence, it was a deliberate land grab orchestrated 15 years ago. Sophia's team scrambled. They accused Tom of fabricating records, questioned Walter's motives, and claimed emotional distress from community harassment. But Jane was relentless, presenting 50 years of deeds, tax records, and photos of Walter's land before the mansions existed. Betty Harris testified about construction crews moving stakes in 2008, her voice shaking but clear. "They told us it was for utilities," she said. "We trusted them." The jury, a mix of local farmers and city folks, leaned forward, their faces hardening as the HOA's lies unraveled. Closing arguments were electric. Sophia's attorney painted Walter as a greedy opportunist, but the argument fell flat against the weight of evidence. Jane's closing was a masterpiece. "This isn't about a fence or a fine. It's about stealing a man's legacy, land his father bought with honest work. Walter Harrison measured the truth, and no amount of money can change it." Walter looked at the jury, thinking of Jane, his wife, who loved that gazebo and those sunsets. He'd fought for her as much for himself. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman's voice was steady. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Walter Harrison. The 1973 deed is valid, and the defendant's structures encroach on his property." The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted, activists cheered, Sophia's team froze. The judge ordered the HOA to pay $500,000 in damages and legal fees, and the 5 mansion owners, Sophia, Nathan, Alina, Jackson, and Bethany, were to pay Walter annual rent for the land their structures occupied, totaling $120,000 a year. If they refused, they'd have to demolish and rebuild elsewhere. Walter walked out of the courthouse into a sea of cameras. "This is for my father, who built this life, and Jane, who loved it," he said, his voice breaking. The crowd roared. Sophia slipped out a side door, her empire crumbling. That evening, Walter stood in his garden, the gazebo glowing under the stars. He'd won not just his land, but a legacy of justice. Sunset Hills would never be the same, and neither would the story of the surveyor who measured his way to victory.